Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be going over the Paradox Rift set review and seeing how we did, because the Paldean Fates set is going to be released in 4 days time actually, and it's going to be legal in early Feb. I think it's the 9th that set becomes legal. It's going to be a subtle set, it's not going to be a long set review, the Paldean Fates one, but I always like to look back and see how well we did in our major set reviews, because although the Paradox Rift format is still going on, we've had a number of regionals at this point, so lots to look at in terms of the results so far. So let's see how we did. I'm going to pop up here. Hello, good to see you. And we'll start with Professor Sada. I should actually move myself across a little bit more so you can see the community ratings alongside mine. We gave Sada the 5-star treatment, thinking that Roaring Moon was going to be one of the premier decks, actually. And fortunately enough, Roaring Moon has made a top 8 now, but it massively flopped the LAIC. I think it was going to be one of the most hyped decks, I think, from the top of my head, in sort of the top 3 in popularity at the LAIC, and flunked. It really didn't do all that great. Since then, it has been a lot less played and has achieved a decent number of top 16 placements, has finally broken into that top 8 with Ross Cawthorn with the really interesting build, which is playing a mixture of Sada's Researchers and Ionos. I think Sada going forward is certainly going to be a 5-star card, because there's not only the Roaring Moon EX deck, there's also going to be Raging Bolt EX, as well as the single prize Roaring Moon, and possibly even the Great Tusk Mill deck. Sada's going to be important in all of those archetypes, so I think it is going to be fulfilling that potential. I think right now it's more fair to say that Roaring Moon is like a tier 2 deck, so I think a 4-star is probably more appropriate. But at the same time, the deck wouldn't even exist. Any ancient deck really wouldn't exist without the Sada, so it is still a critical component, so it's not too far wrong to have given it that 5-star treatment. And in terms of the synergy cards, you can see pretty much everything there. I think the only thing we didn't really touch on was possibly like Moltres and Forest of Stone, but that may be on the Roaring Moon slide anyway, so yeah. Let's go on to Vessel. Now, this is a 5-star card. This is absolutely busted. Yes, it's really important for the Sada engines, which I talked about. It's pretty important for like Baxcalibur, although that deck didn't do all that well. Lugia didn't do all that well either. A lot of the decks on here didn't do great. Gholdengo is kind of a roguey deck, sort of around that tier 2-3 range, I would say, that is utilizing Vessel. I think it mostly impressed in the Rapid Strike deck, actually, which was, interestingly enough, a deck that we kind of undersold, and I think that will be one of the leading factors for some of our strange ratings, I suppose. Some of the ones that we were a bit off the mark on was that we weren't all that hype about Rapid Strike, to be honest with you. And we basically thought that Valiant was going to be overtaking Rapid Strike. That was our big prediction, I suppose, as like a spoiler for things to come. But Vessel is really good in the Rapid Strike deck, actually, as like a 2 count that really allows you to thin the deck nicely and gets you great access to those waters in the early stages. So for that reason, and for its versatility, I'm going to keep it that 5-star. I think that's pretty fair. Ancient Boost Energy Capsule, again, we did lower it from all the other Ancient ratings, because we were like, this is a maybe card, it doesn't always go in. But we did enjoy the option of Bonnet and Roaring Moon. I liked the math fixing of Calamity Storm going to 230, so you didn't always have to Frenzied Gouge. I think more recently we've seen Emergency Jelly come into Roaring Moon so that you are able to gouge, just because 230 isn't that good of a number, because things like Miraidon play health buffs anyway. Sometimes even Entei Valiant plays 1 Bravery Charm, so you have to gouge quite often, to be honest. So Ancient Booster Capsule is a 1/2 count in current Roaring Moons that are playing some amount of Town Store, so it's still an important card. So I think the 4-star is kind of generous. The good news is that Bonnet might be becoming a better card in the distant future as well, when we have post-rotation, because we have more poison modification from not only the Sneasler that you do see on the slide, but also a new stadium card that can help out there as well. So that's going to be important. Funnily enough, I did mention Clow on the slide as well, and that was kind of the best way that we saw Ancient Boost Energy Capsule, I suppose. Clow obviously being this rogue deck as well still, that hasn't had any fantastic placements, has had a fair few day 2 placements, but nothing that deep. But yeah, I think it's fair that we rated this lower than the other ancient stuff. Onto the future stuff. Look at this. People were giving this a 5-star treatment. I remember really avidly saying that this card will not see any play in the current standard format, which was completely true, I think. All the best Entei Valiants did not play this card, just play VIP and Ultra Ball, because that gives you higher, and even Nest Ball comes in before this card, because you want access to Squawk, you want access to your Entei and your other Pokemon, not just your Valiants in the opening stages, and there wasn't going to be a future-style deck. Now, post-rotation, there will be a future-style deck, so Radar will go from this 1-star, which was correct, by the way, going all the way up to like a 4/5-star, depending on how good the future deck will be. So a good card to have held on to, but yeah, correct for us to give it this low of a rating, even though the actual effect of the card is all that strong. The way that we do our ratings is based on the current standard format as Paradox Rift was released, so we were bang on with this one. Professor Churo's 3-star rating I think is pretty fair. This has seen a bit of niche play in Gardevoir and in Charizard, no more ever than a 1 copy at times. It's seen some play in New VMAX as well, as an upgrade to things like Volo and Penny that have been in some of those lists as well, to offset some Sableye numbers and whatnot. And it's mostly not in Snorlax because they still stick with Penny just so that they can keep tools around as well. So I think 3 is actually pretty close for this card, honestly. I think we did pretty well saying that it was going to be that maybe card, and it's right to have Snorlax on the slide. Like, this is a reason why it was a relevant card in the format, not just the healing elements, that this plus Palpad sometimes gave you a lot of outs to get around block, and I think that's pretty much where the card lies and continues to lie. So yeah, I think we got that one pretty spot on, and 3 is actually kind of solid as well, because most people can't actually be bothered to tech the card, but it's still an option for sure. Future Booster, we did rate the 5-star, so this goes back to what I was saying earlier, when we really rated Valiant very, very highly. We were kind of worried about the Tachyon Bits donk potential of some of these evolving decks. Basically, the format that we were picturing was just quite different. We thought that Valiant was going to be better, we thought that Iron Hands Chien-Pao was going to be better, and Valiant being good into that matchup made us think that Valiant would be really good, which is some interesting early format logic, I suppose. We thought this was going to be an all-star in the like rapid Valiant builds as well as like Xatu Valiants, which we were quite high on. Because Arven could easily go into Miraidon, we thought it could make itself a one-of to make Iron Hands, you know, a more flexible attacker and whatnot, improve its numbers here and there, so that you could amp you very much for 3 prizes into Pidgeot, for example. So, yeah, a few niche things there that were helpful, and you can see Town Store synergy. We were basically saying that with these decks that could easily fit in 1 booster capsule, even if you were like teching hands, that didn't really happen all that often. Most of the Miraidons were going with different tools, just more like generic tools, hit point buffs so that Iron Hands sticks, or EXP shares more recently just to bounce back from a Hands response. And the Valiant decks kind of flopped. Obviously, Entei Valiant had that big LAIC performance, but Entei wasn't even on our radar, wasn't in many of Japan's early tournaments either. That deck kind of crept up as we were starting to play with physical cards like in the West, really. So that sort of gained a lot of traction later on into the Paradox meta. Pre the set release, it was mostly like Rapid Valiant and this is R2 deck that people were experimenting with, and I think Future Booster was an all-star in that deck, and this card still is like in a vacuum so powerful, and post-rotation I think it's going to be great in possibly, I've done it once, I might fall into the same trap. A Xatu Valiant could do well in post-rotation format because Iron Crown EX is so busted, and because there's Cryptomaniac, which has good synergy with Xatu. But also this card is going to be really important for the future box that uses the like reboot pod or whatever you call it, for acceleration and the Miraidon and whatnot. So it is going to be a really important card in the future. Then we have some bad supporters: Larry, Mela, Norman, Parasol Lady, Rika, Roark, and Chantal, and Tulip. There were some possible good decks, and even though we liked Xatu, it showed that this card was just too niche. Catcher, the obvious 5-star. We have Guardy on the slide. We have Charizard on the slide, we have Tina on the slide, we have Snorlax, we have everything. Yeah, this was a no-brainer, honestly. This might actually still be the most impactful and strongest card of the set, to be honest with you. Yeah, absolutely crazy card. I think Prime Catcher's going to have an interesting interaction with Counter Catcher. I actually think decks that currently play Counter Catcher will probably continue to do so and not play Prime, because we actually have started to see, like, Gardevoir could easily play the hit point buffing tool, and Charizard EX could easily be playing the maximum belt tool as well to improve its early game damage output with Burning Darkness, but also as you push into the sort of mid and late game, it gets even stronger as well, so you can hit other stage 2 EXs like in the mirror and such. So I think decks that play Countercatcher will continue to do so, which is kind of an interesting interaction actually, and a cool thing about Ace Specs. But then there are these like mid-range aggressive decks like Chien-Pao, which may have played Countercatcher in the past. Maybe they still do play Countercatcher going into post-rotation, but they can play that plus a Prime Catcher as well, which gives them a lot of good coverage actually from item form to make the Arvens and the Iridas and stuff really good supporters going into the next set. Snorlax Doll, obvious 1-star. Defiance Vest, we gave 2-star for possible tank stuff. I think it very rarely made it into Snorlax, so we'll drop it down to the 1-star. Rev of Room, though, think of post-rotation when there's no path left. Genius. Curse Duster is obviously terrible. Mantle we gave 2-star, I think because it made it into Blocklax, which is a tier 1 deck. It's an important one-off because it means that Mimikyu survives like Valiant decks, for example, whereas if you just have Bravery Charms, maybe they have enough switch cards to actually push through you on certain turns or make you spend pennies a lot more aggressively. So even though this is like a 1 count, I think the card is big enough in control, specifically on Mimikyu and specifically for that like last chance saloon of your last Snorlax, I suppose. I'm going to jump this up to 4 stars, I think. I also think this has some potential, well, certainly early in the format, people were playing this in Gardevoir with Screamtail as well. I think that's kind of been wheedled out to be like not worth the space compared to Zacian, which was always my stance. But I do think post-rotation, this will be the best way to play Gardevoir actually with Drifloon and with Screamtail having this hit point buff. So yeah, I think it is going to be a pretty solid card going forward actually. Blindside, correct 1-star. Devolution. Now this is one of our big mistakes as well. So Devo is so strong of an effect actually that it's found its way into Charizard for the mirror matches. Rapid Strike, which I already said earlier, we like underestimated Rapid because we thought Valiant was just better Rapid. But Rapid is still the best way of spreading counters in terms of high-tier decks, and this utilizes Devo. I'm quite happy that a number of Judge Path Mews did play Devo in their lists for a disruption option. That was like the only thing that I could see this doing play in, and you can see I had Sableye Townstar on here as well. I didn't think that the Lost Zone engines were going to incorporate this because I expected Evolution decks to play Jirachi anyway, so a bit of like weird backwards thinking, but it turns out you can just like cram punch stuff, even gust stuff up, and still get a decent Devo off, even if you just take like a single prize on a Devo play, because you're making them pick up Pidgeot and this, that, and the other. They can just be left with nothing available, and Charizard quickly became one of the top 3 decks in the format, so Devo became this really important tech card going forward, and is somewhat the reason why Gardevoir is still under threat as well. So yeah, this is a really, really powerful tool. I'm going to jump up to 5 stars because it goes into Lost Box, Mirror, Rapid. It basically kept Rapid afloat, to be honest with you. Yeah, really, really powerful card. It's really interesting to see the smorgasbord of how people rated it. We were very much on the low end, and I think that was, in hindsight, a bit of an error. It's crazy that I had a Jumpluff on this slide for like a combo Devolve deck rather than a Rapid Strike deck that we knew was good in the past. So crazy, actually. TM Evo, we rated the big 5, and this is another one where we have to lower this quite substantially, actually. So interestingly, where we went wrong, at the time, Japan's early tournaments had a mixture of Pidgeot Zard as well as Bibarel Zard, which obviously played the Arven Evo package, but also I was really high on Evo Gardy when I was making these slides, actually, because I believed that this was the best way to defend yourself against Iron Hands. What I hadn't predicted was that Gardy was basically just going to scoop 2 Iron Hands if it just came on the board too quickly, which is still super weird for me. But I tell you what, I'm going to be trying Evo Gardy post-rotation, and obviously you get to cut a lot of stadiums in Gardy next set, so I think you have the space for this package, and because you're going to be playing Drifloon and Screamtail with tools anyway, the Arven just doesn't fall off quite as hard in the mid-game either, so I have hope that Gardy can make a resurgence. Even Gholdengo didn't play the Evo package. That was initially what it was touted to be, where you would Evo into like Bibarels or Curliers as well as Gholdengos on the bench, or sometimes even backup attackers on your bench, whereas turned out it was an Irida package best for Gholdengo, which is super interesting. But yeah, I do think there is still hope for this tool in this combination next set and next format. But yeah, it's interesting that Pidgeot really stamped out any Bibarels art. I think there was 1 or 2 top 8 placements for Bib, but it's really not being played that much anymore. And then Arven Gardy was a deck that I was high on, but never even became the way to play Gardy going forward. It was random things like Deoxys, V-Star that made its way in over this sort of package to defend yourself against Iron Hands. Turbo Energize, obviously very poor. Medical Energy, poor. So onto the summary then. I think we oversold possibly a little bit of the Ancient package. It turned out it was more of like a tier 2 deck rather than a new aggressive tier 1 deck. The Lux Cape we kind of underrated, and we got the Evo Devo combo mixed up. And it's kind of interesting that because I rated Evo so high, I thought Devo would be less powerful, but because Evo didn't do well, Rare Candy was bigger, which made Devo stronger. So it's a really interesting way that worked out. But yeah, Devo, crazy card, and we'll continue to be punishing these Rare Candy based builds. Let's zip through some EXs then. Frostlass obviously poor, Armor Rouge, people like this card as well. Garchomp, also people like the card. You can see I have a lot of combo stuff, but it was just too much work for not enough like instant payoff. Apparently 160 for 1 on turn 2 is just too slow these days. Golisopod, pretty poor. Serena, yeah, people saw the combo, they were dreamers, but it's obviously way too clunky. Mewtwo, very poor. Tapu Koko, I think the 3 stars pretty fair. It did have its 1 or 2 tournaments, which was pretty much all I was ever expecting out of this card, that there would be those situations where paralysis wasn't respected and there was a window of opportunity for people to capitalize on this. And that's pretty much exactly what we've seen in Miraidon. There was like 1 or 2 weeks where Tapu Koko was the right tech card to help against your dodgy matchup of Charizard. Now, once again, Charizard is being like forced to play a switch out at least, so yeah, it's a lot less effective, but you can still catch people off guard. I was always expecting that if you were playing Miraidon, playing Path and Iono gave you a chance, even if your opponent did have switch outs in their deck list, but it turned out people were just waiting for the chance to play an aggressive build that didn't even have any disruption supporters and just said, I hope your list doesn't play an out, let's try and shove in a Revenge Shock and try and two-shot this bad boy. Yeah, that's pretty much the strat. It didn't make it into any Lost Box decks though. So Iron Hands EX, definitely not the doomsday that was predicted by a number of people. You can see that we gave it the 5-star treatment just for its versatility, and I think that's still where you have to treat this card, because of the things on this slide, it's fair to say that like it didn't find its way into like stage 2 decks as this one-of inclusion. It didn't work that well in Gem Power, it didn't work that well in Lugia, but it worked well enough in certainly Flaffy and Mirage Gate decks that this is still a really top contender and sort of keeps those decks relevant, honestly, because it does give you that really early very much pressure to take multiple prize knockouts on some lower hit point evolving things or just engine Pokemon like Comfey and stuff. So yeah, still a very powerful card. It gets better as well post-rotation, I think, because it gets even more supporting cards. So yeah, I think it continues to be a real threat in the format. And I think the rating is still solid. Like, this is obviously a very powerful card and is a game-changing and game-warping card in that you don't have to go bossing around to carve out 2 prize turns. You can have multi-prize turns whilst doing draw supporters or this, that, and the other, which is just inherently breaking the game, I think. So, and Miraidon's had a really interesting like hype cycle as well, obviously winning the international championships, the LAIC, and then being pretty high on the radar, and also sort of carving the path for Charizard to be a like strong metagame choice because it was challenging the Miraidon players, and now we've come sort of full circle where Charizard is like the deck to beat and Miraidon has to fear Zard and whatnot, and now like Tina's in that cycle of starting to overcome Zard as like the Bidif. It's won, you know, back-to-back tournaments. So yeah, that cycle is pretty interesting right now. Cofagrigus, 1 star. Iron Valiant, we rated 5. I think this is kind of too high. I think we should drop this down to 4. Yes, it did well in Internats, and it has had some top 32 placements, but really of all the things we wanted to see here, it didn't make it into Guardi, it didn't make it into Lost Box, which there was like some conversation of it being a tech one-of even in both of those decks. It then also flopped as its own deck with Xatu, and the Urshi deck was also overhyped, so somehow it didn't see all that much play. I think it still has a really good chance of being a decent deck in terms of an Entei Valiant going into the post-rotation meta, because you do have Techno Radar to still tutor out your basics pretty aggressively. And I think it could be part of this future box as well, where Tachyon Bits helps out with Iron Crown, where you can get preliminary damage on other things as you go. So it can help you push through different Pokemon at the same time as offering up a Laser Blade, which gets buffed by Iron Crown as well. So I believe there could still be a Xatu deck. I believe it could be part of the future deck. So yeah, Valiant will end up being that sort of 5-star prophecy card, but kind of fell short of that mark in this format. Maybe even as low as 3-star, honestly, because the Valiant decks are so few and far between. Sandy Shock CX, yeah, this was the card that was kind of lying in wait until we got the new Raging Bolt, so pick up your Sandy Shocks now. It's going to start becoming a playable card, but didn't really see much of a home. There's never been a Roaring Moon deck that's played the fighting dual type. It's actually played Water and Lightning Energy, which is ironic for other attackers before looking towards its sort of ancient partners of the fighting dudes. So Roaring Moon, we rated the 5-star, and I think this is actually pretty fair for the card, because not only does it make its own deck, which is probably like its tier 2 deck at the end of the day, but also it's found its way alongside the Lost Box engine, where just having Mirage Gate has opened doors for some Lost Boxes. It's made its way into some Tinas as well, certainly in Japan, and it gives you some type coverage and a different way of getting a one-hit KO option. So the card is inherently so powerful, having that delete option when needed. It has combinations with Emergency Jelly as well, which is still kind of being discovered and refined. So yeah, the card is still certainly powerful. Its own deck, maybe just a tier 2 deck, but was also a decent tech option, which kind of saves its rating, I think. Aegislash EX 1 star. Gholdengo, we gave the 4-star treatment. Probably have to take it down to a 3-star. Mostly just the fact that you have to fit in such specific cards, and you still don't have great stage 1 search, was still hurting the Gholdengo. It's interesting that I did have the Irida package on here. I didn't actually have the Palkia Vsar side of things, which is kind of interesting. I liked the Irida package to have the option, certainly, of Greninja and Manaphy in the opening stages, but I was also trying that Basculin as well pretty early on. But yeah, like a quad worker was also pretty important. That's on the slide. You can see the different forms of getting energy out into play. All these sorts of things came together. I think most people expected this card to be good because, again, having one hit go potential, having draw power, having some type coverage, if people expected Chen Power to be good. There was a lot of elements to like with the Gholdengo deck, but it kind of just fell short of the mark. Again, I think this card gets way better when Path goes next set. Skeledirge will take down to 1 star. It's too much work compared to the other stage 2s. Maltsold, obviously 1 star. Bombardier. And then we have the bulky X's, which certainly were the bulky X's. Interestingly enough, I was terrified pre-LAIC because I hit Tord on ladder twice, and he was playing Hooper EX in his Lost Box deck as a Iron Hands answer when he had Roaring Moon and Hooper EX in this one amalgamation. So I was low-key terrified that Tord was out there breaking the formats, playing on PTG Live, and I was terrified that this bulky X, I didn't even give a rating on its own, I didn't even give it its own slide. I was terrified that that was going to see a huge amount of play and Tord was going to ruin my my day, but it turns out Tord didn't go down that avenue, and Hooper EX isn't mandatory in the Lost Box deck, so we dodged a bullet there, thank goodness. I think overall we did pretty well with the ratings. I think it's fair to give Iron Hands and Moon those 5-star treatments. I think Gholdengo probably goes down to that 3, and the Valiant goes down to like a 3 as well. I think those are the only things that I think are all that egregious, and then the Skeledirge, yeah, didn't see that much experimentation. I think Garchomp and Serena saw enough like gimmicky fun experimentation that they were kind of solid for that 2-star rating, and the Coco did have its chance in the sun and had 1 or 2 placements, so yeah, I think we did really well on the X's overall. And then for the single prize stuff, the Simmies, yeah, terrible. Toadscruel did have a week or 2 of experimentation because there was that Japanese like top 8 tournament or whatever, the Masters tournament. But yeah, I don't think it was experimented for much after that. Iron Moth, terrible. Bundle did see a tiny bit of experimentation again with Chen Pao, but that fell off pretty quickly. So I think it's fair to give it the 1-star treatment. I do think this card, when Rope goes though, gets substantially better. That's the only reason we rated this card low actually, was because I thought Rope would always get the nod over Bundle, because I thought we'd be wanting an excuse to put more switch cards into our deck, so we helped ourselves against Snorlax. And that's pretty much exactly what people are doing right now. But when Rope goes, Bundle becomes like a unique card in terms of this is the only way you can get that push effect without having to use a boss, right? Or like a counter catcher. So yeah, pretty important card and probably is going to see a bit more play in the future. Vanillux, terrible. Xatu, we rated the 4-star. We believed. It's going to go down to like the 2-star, I suppose, because it did see experimentation, but only very early on in the online space and then really fell off pretty quickly. I think the card isn't going to be like incredible next format, but I do think that it's possible that there's going to be a Valiant Crown deck where just a combination of those 2 Futuremons are good enough for, and they have like enough internal synergy between them where Crown's attack can do some spread damage that gets around Manaphy, so has synergy with Tachyon Bits early, and then if you're up against other multi-prize decks, the fact that Crown buffs Laser Blade, plus you have Tachyon Bits on top of that, means that Valiant is going to be that sort of dangerous Pokemon that can hit towards that sort of 260, 280 threshold if you have enough dancing with Tachyon Bits. So I do think Xatu is likely to get a little bit better. Obviously, Valiant doesn't have to worry about playing Path Bouncers itself either, so it can also gain some spaces from previous builds of Xatu that I'd already had sort of created for this format. So yeah, I think it gets a little bit better inherently. I don't necessarily think this is going to be like a barnstorming deck though, so like maybe looking towards the future like a 3-star card perhaps, but in this format all the way down to a 2 I think for just early experimentation really. Espathra, pretty terrible. Screamtail, so this was the other like big blunder I suppose. Now it's kind of fortunate that Gardevoir has really cooled off in the metagame, because there was a time, certainly early after LAIC in those couple of weeks, everyone expected Gardevoir to be the Bediff, and Screamtail plus Avery plus Countercatcher was like the main selling point of Gardevoir. This was one of the main crazy things. So I went wrong with Gardevoir in a couple of directions. As I said earlier with the TM Evo, I was trying to build Gardevoir as an Evo build, which meant that I didn't really have the space for the Screamtail Avery stuff in the first place. The fact that I didn't think of Screamtail that much as a combo is a bit of a shame. I also thought that Roaring Scream's numbers weren't that great. I was aware that there was going to be more Squawkability in the format, but I kind of underestimated how good Screamtail was for just being a one-for-one option at dealing with, you know, Bats Caliburs, Barrels, any evolving early game Pokemon, just for such a low amount of energy in your discard pile as well. So it meant that you could draw quite poorly and still have a play, which was one of the main things that made Screamtail so good. You're keeping your engine Pokemon safe in the back, you're representing a threat that's getting you advanced in your game state, which is really handy for Gardevoir. I also thought that many people were rating Screamtail quite highly because they wanted to make this like Drifloon deck work, which obviously still didn't happen, and Screamtail is best in a Gardevoir build that has no other support around it and just says that Screamtail hits 160 and that's a good enough number. So that's another thing where I kind of went down the rabbit hole thinking that people were going to try and build this really clunky build of Gardevoir that had all these gimmicks, and I never really wanted that to be what Gardevoir was, and I was sort of correct in that line of thinking, but undersold how effective Screamtail is as just this one card that you can pull out during the game and do a 1-for-1 or do sometimes 2-prize knockout onto Squawkabilly, or the fact that you could try and two-shot something whilst also doing a Panic Iono countercatcher. That's another big combo that I missed. Even if you're not doing the Avery shenanigans, the fact that there was countercatcher Iono, hope your opponent doesn't have a switch out whilst I two-shot something or get myself back into the game with a sniping play, was so massive for Gardevoir. So I undersold how powerful it was as like a game changer in that respect, where Gardevoir is always playing from behind. This was a great way for you to take out an engine Pokemon whilst trapping things or doing this, that, and the other. So it opened up a lot of lines for Gardy. That being said, I'd say Gardevoir's around a tier 2 deck right now, so I'll go all the way up to 4-star with Screamtail. We got this one pretty badly wrong, and hold my hands up for that. But I just wanted to talk about my logic as to where I was thinking Gardevoir was in the format and as to why I was against the arguments of Screamtail, I suppose, rather than the ratings themselves early on in the format. Clorf we gave the 1-star. We pretty much outlined everything that would happen with Clorf, but we just thought it was bad, and I guess the one thing we didn't mention was that Hisuian Electrode plus Spicy Curry was actually the right way to make Clorf. Who knew? So I guess Clorf has to go up to a 3-star for being a very relevant type in the format, which made a gimmicky like rogues or slash tier 3 type coverage toolbox, which just about worked. Minior was a late entry into our slides, and it was just to be this counter to block Snorlax, and that's exactly kind of what it has been. I don't think many decks have actually ever played this Minior. I think it's been in a super effective Glasses build of Lost Box, and I think some Charizards flirted with the idea of it, but then ultimately didn't go for the Minior, so I think 2 is actually pretty much spot on, where it's been a consideration card, but many people don't actually make the space for it, and that's more or less where we expected it to be, which is a pretty nice one that we got spot on there. Slitherwing, we're going to stick with that 1-star. Brute Bonnet, we gave the 4-star. I think we can drop this down to 3, even though it made that sort of Clorf deck happen. It was mostly a not include in Roaring Moon, which makes me think it's probably worth dropping a little bit. Crobat, definitely a glamorous and interesting 1-star card. Garbodor should go down to the 1-star. Don't know what I was thinking here. Maybe just because it was a dark type I was a believer. Jirachi, I'm pretty happy with the 4-star. It's like a guaranteed include in Charizard. It makes its way into Sablezard. It makes its way into like 50% of Guardies, maybe a little bit under 50% to be honest with you. So I think it's done just enough to warrant that rating. And then Tatsugiri, probably just that 1-star because Block Collapse was the only way that we built control in this format. It just seemed to be the best way to go. It still has that powerful attacking option, but it turns out just Countercatcher Block is enough for combo that you don't need anything else attacking. And then we end on Iron Jugulis. Even though I believed in the Xatu deck, I didn't think Jugulis made it, because this was a bit of a dreamer combo for a deck that had such tight bench space. I think we'll drop this down to a 1-star because I don't expect it even in future Xatu builds or future Toolbox builds. I don't think it makes the space in any of those, I'm afraid. So I think it was a little bit weaker this time. We were pretty high on Xatu, which didn't do all that well. Completely aired Screamtail, got it completely wrong, and was quite avidly against this card for a little while. In all the builds that I'd had early on of Gardevoir, it just didn't fit the profile. But as Gardevoir became more and more of this let me come back from like a 4-prize deficit deck, Screamtail became the one basically. underestimated Clorf's potential. It's a big basic that has good type coverage, and I think that's the main thing. And outside of that, a little bit of experimentation here or there, but overall we were not high on many of these cards. So yeah, not too shabby overall with our review. I think the most egregious one is the Screamtail, but everything else I think is fairly justified. I also think the TM Devo was a bit of a bad miss. That was the Paradox Rift review. There are still a ton of tournaments in this format, and Paldean Fates stuff is going to be coming soon, but expect that set review to be like 10 minutes because there is nothing good in that set whatsoever. So, yeah, unfortunately, we're here for another few months. I don't think the format's going to get stale. I just think it's going to be cyclical. The top contenders that we're already aware of are going to be making small tweaks here and there, adjusting to the meta as different ones spike and dip in popularity. That's more or less what I expect for the next few months. Hopefully the game stays fresh and interesting because luckily it's a wide enough format that people can bring all sorts to these tournaments. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.